The rain poured down the window of the car parked on the corner of the deserted street. Each drop seemed to amplify the weight of that sight, like a silent hammer striking my mind. There she was, in the flickering light of the room that escaped through the half-open curtains. There was no mistaking it. My heart, which had carried the certainty of a solid, reciprocal love for so many years, now seemed trapped in a whirlwind of disbelief and pain. The sofa, which had so often hosted our conversations, now became the stage for a scene I could never have imagined. They were together, hugging, as if the world outside didn't exist. His muffled laughter reached me even with the window closed. She tilted her head, resting it on his shoulder, as if seeking comfort that, until that moment, I had believed was only mine to offer. My cell phone was in my pocket. My hands were shaking. The desire to record that scene, to turn it into proof of a betrayal that I was still reluctant to accept as real, fought against a primal instinct to simply leave, run, scream. But I stayed there. Steadfast, like a statue watching its own ruin. Why here? Why him? The question echoed in my mind like a desperate cry. I knew every detail of that house. It was his house. Her boss. How many times had she mentioned the overtime, the last-minute meetings, the late-night messages? I, in my blind trust, didn't question it. I didn't understand. I didn't want to see. And now I was standing there, facing the raw truth. It could have ended right then and there, but something inside me wouldn't let me go. I stayed, each second stretching out like an eternity as the scene on the other side of the window continued. They were laughing. He said something that I couldn't hear, but which made her laugh too, throwing her head back as if free of any guilt or weight. It was at that moment that I realized that, even if I wanted to, I could never erase that vision from my memory. I took a deep breath, but the air seemed to be running out. My chest burned. The rain intensified, but I couldn't move. The world outside seemed to make no sense, while everything I believed in collapsed right there in front of me. How could she do this? I gave everything. Everything. And I still wasn't enough. I thought about confronting them right there, opening the door of that house and pouring out all the fury I'd built up in words that might not even come out clearly. But at the same time, something was holding me back. It wasn't fear, it wasn't hesitation. It was the need to understand. Why did she do it? How did we get to this point? And, above all, since when? An unread message flashed up on my cell phone. It was from her. I'm going to be a bit late. The meeting is long, but don't worry, I'm with him. With him. The irony of those words was a knife in my chest. She was with him, yes. But not in the way she should have been. As time passed and my hand still hesitated between calling her or simply disappearing, the scenes inside that house took on more intimate contours. They got up from the sofa. He held her face with both hands, looking into her eyes as if she were the center of the universe. And she didn't hesitate. She didn't pull away. She just reciprocated. That kiss. I collapsed. Everything that was holding me up seemed to crumble. A lump formed in my throat and the tears finally came, hot, burning, as if they wanted to wash away the pain that was consuming me. But they didn't. They just drowned me even more. The headlight of a passing car briefly illuminated my expression in the rearview mirror. My face looked like that of a stranger. Who was that man, now broken by the person he trusted above all else? Who was I, now reduced to a helpless spectator of my own life being torn in half? Finally, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront them there. Not yet. I got back into the car, started the engine and began to drive aimlessly. My body was on autopilot, but my mind was racing. I needed answers. I needed to understand. And, above all, I needed to decide what to do with what I had just witnessed. But one question was burning in my chest: what else had she hidden from me? If she was capable of betraying not only our love, but everything we had built together, what else was there in that story that I didn't know about? And most importantly, how far would I be willing to go to find out the truth? Welcome to our channel. Here, we don't support any kind of betrayal. The stories you'll hear are fictional, created to show how betrayal can devastate lives and relationships. Our aim is to bring you deep reflections on trust, love, and the consequences of wrong choices. Get ready, because you're about to hear an intense and shocking story. Sit back, take a deep breath and immerse yourself in this narrative full of emotion and twists and turns. Good story. It was an ordinary afternoon when Daniel, a man with a firm posture and a calm countenance, parked his car in his driveway. The street was silent, except for the occasional sound of children playing in the distance. He always enjoyed this time of day, when work was behind him and the family routine awaited him. In his mind, the home he had built with Clara was a refuge. Every corner of that house bore the mark of their joint choices, from the carefully chosen furniture to the photographs of happy moments that decorated the walls. Clara was a captivating woman. She had a smile that lit up the room and a gentle way of dealing with people that made Daniel silently proud. When she spoke, there was a balance between sweetness and determination that won over everyone around her. Clara was respected in her job, an administrative position in a medium-sized company, and despite the constant demands, she always managed to maintain harmony at home. Their relationship was, in the eyes of those who knew them, an example of partnership. They met at a party thrown by mutual friends and, from then on, it didn't take them long to realize that they shared similar dreams. They got married after 3 years of dating and, since then, they have faced together the ups and downs that time naturally brings. Daniel worked for an engineering company and, despite the constant pressure, he enjoyed what he did. The financial stability his job provided gave him the satisfaction of seeing Clara pursue her own career without having to worry so much about finances. He was proud of this, but he also felt a growing tiredness that often made him long for quieter nights with his wife. The couple's shared routines had a charm of their own. On Saturdays, Clara liked to cook breakfast while Daniel read the news on his tablet. On Sundays, they used to visit a local market to buy fresh fruit and flowers. These small rituals brought a comfort that, for Daniel, was the essence of a fulfilling life. But, as in any relationship, not everything was perfect. The two had their differences. Clara was more outgoing and felt energized in social settings, while Daniel preferred more private moments. Even so, they always found a balance. Or so Daniel believed. In recent weeks, Clara had seemed more distant. It was nothing blatant, but Daniel noticed the subtle changes. She was more absorbed in her cell phone, answered questions automatically and occasionally seemed lost in thought. He initially attributed it to the stress of work. Clara was involved in an important project that required constant meetings and a lot of overtime. "Are you all right?" he asked from time to time, looking at her with the veiled concern he always carried. "Just tired," she replied with a quick smile, trying to reassure him. Daniel trusted her and so didn't insist. Clara's boss, Miguel, was a respected man in his field, but little known to Daniel. He only knew the essentials. Miguel had a charismatic personality, was admired by the staff and often praised for his ability to lead. Clara occasionally mentioned his name during conversations about work, but nothing that aroused Daniel's suspicions. As Clara got deeper and deeper into her work, Daniel began to notice something else. Although he was always available for her, Clara seemed to seek out distractions that took her away from moments together. Evenings that used to be filled with relaxed conversations about the day were now often silent, with Clara reviewing documents on her laptop or exchanging messages on her cell phone. He watched her in silence, trying to understand if this was just a phase. Still, the connection between the two had its moments of brilliance. That same week, Clara prepared Daniel's favorite dinner, a gesture that rekindled his hope that everything was all right. "I just wanted to spoil you a little," she said, putting the plate on the table and smiling. He kissed her on the forehead and thanked her, feeling the familiar warmth of that woman who always knew how to surprise him. Even so, there was something unsettling in the air. Daniel couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, but he sensed an underlying tension in Clara. He began to observe more closely, to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed, the look she looked away when he asked her questions about the day, the vague answers about meetings or appointments outside of her schedule. It was nothing concrete, but something in his intuition told him that there was more going on. Meanwhile, Clara seemed to be navigating an internal maelstrom that Daniel was unaware of. She had days when she was attentive and affectionate, and others when she seemed absent, as if trapped in thoughts she couldn't share. Even so, Daniel tried hard not to pressure her. He believed that space was necessary, especially during periods of stress. That evening, while Clara was getting ready for another work meeting, Daniel sat on the sofa, contemplating the nuances of their relationship. He loved Clara deeply, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was changing. "Will you be back late?" he asked, as he watched her put on her coat. "Probably. Don't wait up for me," she replied, with a smile that seemed forced. After Clara left, Daniel stood there, looking at the clock on the wall. He couldn't explain why, but he felt that tonight was different. Perhaps it was just accumulated tiredness or the feeling that things were out of place. But even without knowing it, that night would mark the beginning of a journey that would forever change the way he saw his life, his marriage and his own strength. The walls of the house they had shared for so many years seemed to carry a heavier weight than usual, as if they sensed that a new chapter was about to begin. Daniel, still sitting on the sofa, watched the shadows that the living room light cast on the furniture, unaware that his view of love, trust and betrayal would soon never be the same. The nights began to take on a weight that Daniel had never felt before. Clara followed the same routine, or at least seemed to, but the distance between them became more palpable. He, for his part, devoted himself even more to the house, trying to create a welcoming atmosphere. He tidied up the garden, adjusted the little details she mentioned casually, like changing a light bulb or reorganizing a cupboard. In his mind, these were gestures to rekindle what seemed to be fading between them. Clara, on the other hand, maintained an increasingly distracted posture. Her schedule, which had once seemed full of purpose, was now marked by long meetings and unexpected events. Daniel didn't object. He understood that her career was important and he respected that. But there was something about the way Clara spoke about these commitments that sounded rehearsed. He tried to ignore the annoyance, but the little pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in a disturbing way. One evening, while Clara was saying that she was going to have dinner with colleagues from work, Daniel watched her more closely. There was something about the way she chose her words, an excessive care in describing the event. He casually asked who would be attending, and she replied with a vague smile, listing names that seemed to come up without much conviction. Daniel didn't insist. He just wished her a good time and said he'd wait up for her. But that night, he couldn't just go about his routine. Restlessness overwhelmed him. He tried watching a movie, read a few chapters of a book he loved, but nothing seemed to calm him down. When he looked at his watch, he realized that it was already past midnight. Clara still hadn't returned and her cell phone was switched off. He sat in the dark room, the only sound being the clock on the wall. Daniel's mind wandered between possible scenarios. Maybe she was just tired and had forgotten to tell him. Perhaps dinner had gone on too long. But what if it wasn't that? For the first time, he allowed doubt to consume him. Something was out of place, and he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. Over the next few days, Daniel began to observe more closely. It wasn't in his nature to be suspicious, but Clara's behavior no longer seemed consistent with the woman he knew. The messages on her cell phone were answered more frequently at night, but he never saw the screen on. The device was always turned down. She seemed to avoid moments of intimacy, justifying it with tiredness or work worries. Daniel began to notice patterns. Every Wednesday Clara had meetings that lasted until late. On Saturdays, appointments came up that hadn't existed before. And whenever he asked, the answer came with a smile, but never any concrete details. He felt doubt eating away at his certainties. Even so, part of him refused to accept the possibility of something darker. It was on a Wednesday evening that Daniel decided, for the first time, to act differently. Clara had left saying she had to stay late for a meeting with the team. He waited for her to leave and, instead of settling down on the sofa, he got into his car. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he felt he needed to do something. He drove through the almost deserted streets, with no clear destination. After a while, he passed Clara's company. The parking lot was almost empty, but her car wasn't there. Daniel parked and watched for a few minutes. The absence of the vehicle didn't prove anything in itself, but it made him feel a heaviness in his chest. Something was happening, and he needed to understand what it was. That same week, during a particularly quiet night, Daniel received a message from a mutual friend, who mentioned having seen Clara leaving a restaurant in the city center. She seemed well accompanied, said the text, accompanied by an emoji that Daniel couldn't interpret. He thanked her for the information, but didn't respond beyond that. The comment echoed in his mind. He didn't want to believe it, but he needed answers. It was the following week that Daniel decided to follow Clara. She had mentioned yet another important meeting, and he knew he couldn't simply continue ignoring her growing discomfort. He waited for her to leave the house and, shortly afterwards, he got in his car and followed. He kept his distance, trying not to be noticed. Clara drove calmly to a neighborhood further away, where she parked in front of a house that Daniel didn't know. He parked a few meters back, turning off his headlights. He watched as Clara got out of the car, straightening her coat. The gate of the house opened and a man appeared. Daniel recognized Miguel. Her boss. They exchanged a brief hug and Clara went inside. Daniel stayed in the car, motionless, as he tried to process what he had just seen. The minutes dragged by like hours. He fought the urge to go to the door and demand an explanation. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the fear of confirming what his mind was already beginning to accept as true. He wanted to believe that there was another explanation, that it wasn't what it seemed. But then, the lights in the room came on, and through the slightly open curtains, Daniel saw what he feared. Clara and Miguel were sitting on the sofa, too close for any excuse to be plausible. He watched as they laughed, exchanged complicit glances, and finally kissed. Daniel felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. The image he never wanted to imagine was now right in front of his eyes. The world seemed to spin in slow motion, every detail etched in his mind like a scar that would never fade. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to control his breathing, but the pain was overwhelming. Not knowing what to do, he started the car's engine and slowly drove away. The house, which minutes before had seemed like just another on the quiet street, now became a landmark of its destruction. As he drove through the dark streets, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, sadness, disbelief. But above all, there was the need to understand why. Daniel knew that night was only the beginning. He would need answers. He needed to confront her. And, above all, he needed to find out what else was hidden behind that betrayal. Silence dominated the house. Clara was in the living room, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the floor, while Daniel stood in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, holding the paper that seemed to weigh tons. He had confronted her the night before about what he had seen. The betrayal was exposed, naked and stark, but there were still pieces of the puzzle that didn't make sense. He had demanded that she explain, and now they were standing there, face to face, immersed in a tension that seemed to suffocate the room. Why him, Clara? Why? Daniel's voice came out low, but laden with a pain so deep that it made Clara shudder. She sighed, bringing one of her hands to her face, trying to organize her words. I don't know what to say. I don't know where to start. Start with the truth. He stepped forward, leaving the paper on the table between them. No more excuses, no more vague answers. I need to understand how we got here. Clara looked up, and the expression of guilt on her face was unmistakable. She took a deep breath before beginning. I never planned this, Daniel. I never wanted it to happen. Miguel, he's not just my boss. He was someone from my past, someone who, until a few months ago, I believed was out of my life forever. Daniel frowned, his mind beginning to process the implications of her words. From the past? What do you mean? She hesitated, but knew she could no longer run away. Before I met you, Miguel and I had a relationship. It was brief, but intense. We broke up because he had other interests, because I knew he could never offer me stability. When I met him again at work, it was as if everything I'd tried to forget came flooding back. The silence between them became even heavier. Daniel clenched his fists, struggling to stay calm. And you thought it would be a good idea, to relive it? To betray everything we've built together because of nostalgia? It's not that simple. Clara stood up, her voice heavy with emotion. I felt lost, Daniel. For months, I tried to find a way back to what we were. But it felt like something was broken, something I didn't know how to fix. And you decided to look for that in the arms of another man? He interrupted her, his tone now full of bitterness. In the arms of someone who had left you before? I know I made a mistake. I know I hurt you in a way that I may never be able to repair. Tears began to roll down her cheeks, but Daniel didn't look away. He wanted to hear everything, right to the end. So why go on, Clara? Why lie, invent meetings, dinners? You could have talked to me. Daniel's voice rose, the pain overflowing in every word. Clara stared at him for a moment, her eyes red but determined. Because that's not all, Daniel. There's more. Something that I knew would change everything. He felt a chill. He could see on her face that what was to come would be even more devastating than what he had already faced. Speak up, Clara. Don't prolong this any longer. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to find the strength. Miguel. Miguel knew things about you. Things he used against me. He blackmailed me. Daniel blinked, confused. Blackmailed? About what? What kind of nonsense is that? Clara swallowed, her voice shaking. He had access to confidential information from the company where you work. Information that could compromise you, that could destroy your career. He said that if I didn't cooperate, he'd hand it all over. Daniel's confusion gave way to complete disbelief. Are you saying that he forced you into this? That he used information to manipulate you? Clara shook her head, the pain evident in her expression. At first, yes. He used it to get me involved. But then. I don't know. I got caught in this web, not knowing how to get out. I should have told you, I know. But I was afraid, Daniel. Afraid of how you would react, afraid of what might happen. Daniel pulled away, running his hands through his hair as he tried to absorb everything. He felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. The woman he loved, whom he trusted above all else, had been dragged into a plot that seemed surreal. But at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unclear. Why didn't you tell me before? He asked, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. Why did you wait for things to get to this point? Clara sat down again, looking exhausted. Because I thought I could sort it out myself. I thought that if I did what he asked, he'd leave you alone. But that's not what happened. He kept pushing, kept demanding more. I found myself in a hole I couldn't get out of. Daniel stared at her, his eyes fixed on hers. And now? What else does he know? What else can he do? Clara hesitated, but knew she couldn't hide anything else. He has documents, emails, evidence that could be interpreted in the worst possible way. And it's not just you. He could affect other people in your company. He's threatened to destroy everything, Daniel. He felt a rising wave of anger. Not just at the betrayal, but at the manipulation, at the way Miguel had entangled Clara in his plans. Daniel knew he had to act, but at that moment, all he could feel was a mixture of pain and indignation. "What do you want me to do now, Clara?" he asked, his voice cold. "How do you expect me to fix this? That I deal with the fact that you let yourself get involved with him, even though you knew what he was capable of?" Clara didn't answer straight away. She just looked at him, tears still flowing. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Daniel. I don't expect you to trust me again. I just hope that we can deal with this together. Because, deep down, I never stopped loving you." But her words rang hollow for Daniel. The weight of the revelation was overwhelming, and he knew that, from that moment on, his life would never be the same. As silence filled the space between them, he realized that there was still more to discover. And for that, he would have to face Miguel head-on. Daniel left home that night unsure of where to go. Clara's revelation still echoed in his mind, like a weight that seemed to crush every thought. He drove through unfamiliar streets, searching for a silence that his mind couldn't reach. The betrayal, the blackmail, the manipulation, it all seemed like an inescapable web, something he could never have foreseen in his previously solid and predictable life. Anger pulsed through his veins, but it was pain that consumed him. It was difficult to separate the feelings. He didn't know what bothered him more, the fact that Clara had given in to Miguel's pressure, or the fact that she had kept everything a secret for so long. At some point, he parked the car in a deserted street, turned off the engine and just stood there, staring into the emptiness. What was he supposed to do now? Clara had made it clear that Miguel still had some control over the situation, that he could use the information he had to cause irreparable damage. But Daniel knew that giving in was not an option. Not anymore. The thought of facing Miguel filled him with a mixture of determination and trepidation. He had to act, but how? The next morning, Daniel was determined to confront Miguel. He knew where to find him. He didn't want to involve Clara, not yet. This battle was his now. He arrived at Miguel's company building shortly before opening time. He waited in the car until he saw him enter and then followed. The receptionist tried to stop him, but he just mumbled that it was something urgent and continued walking to the main office. Miguel was behind his desk, going over some documents, when Daniel walked in without knocking. The surprise on Miguel's face was instantaneous, but quickly gave way to a confident smile. "Daniel, what a surprise! To what do I owe the honor?" Miguel said, standing up and gesturing for Daniel to sit down. "I'm not going to sit down." Daniel's voice was firm but restrained. He wanted to maintain control, even with the anger bubbling up inside. "I know everything, Miguel. I know what you did. I know how you manipulated Clara." Miguel tilted his head, keeping his expression calm, but his eyes betrayed a flash of nervousness. "Ah, I see. So she finally told you. Well, that saves time." "Saves time." Daniel took a step forward, his tone more aggressive. "Do you think this is some kind of game? You think you can just destroy my life and get away with it?" Miguel sighed, walking over to the window and looking down at the street below. "You need to understand, Daniel. It's not personal. It never has been. It's about business. Clara was a piece on the board." "Business?" Daniel laughed bitterly. "You destroyed my marriage, manipulated my wife and put my career at risk, and you have the audacity to call it business?" Miguel turned to face him, now with a more serious expression. "You don't understand the gravity of what's at stake here. The information I have could bring you and many other people down. And it's not because I want to. It's because sometimes survival requires sacrifice." Daniel felt his patience wearing thin. He took another step forward, his fists clenched. "You're not going to intimidate me, Miguel. Not anymore. I'm going to expose you. This whole disgusting scheme. I'm going to destroy everything you've built, just as you tried to destroy my life. Miguel gave a slight smile, as if he'd been expecting it. And you're willing to sacrifice your career in the process? Your reputation. Because if you attack me, Daniel, I guarantee you won't be the only one to fall. Daniel knew Miguel wasn't bluffing. He felt a knot in his stomach as he realized that the man in front of him had nothing to lose. But he also knew that backing down was not an option. There was a line that Miguel had crossed, and Daniel couldn't just ignore it. Before leaving, Daniel moved even closer, until he was just a few centimeters from Miguel. You may think you're in control now, but remember one thing, the truth always comes out. And when it does, you'll have nowhere to hide. Miguel didn't reply, he just stared at him with the same cold, calculating expression. Daniel left the office with his heart racing, but with renewed determination. He knew the battle was far from over. Returning home, Daniel found Clara in the kitchen, her eyes swollen from crying. She looked at him with a mixture of relief and concern. Did you talk to him? I did. Daniel left the key on the table and sighed. He's exactly what I expected. Cold, manipulative. But he knows we're ready to fight. Clara nodded, but didn't look relieved. Now what? What do we do? I'm not sure yet. But one thing's for sure, he won't get away with it. We'll gather everything we have, every detail. We'll use it against him. Clara hesitated for a moment before approaching. Daniel, I'm so sorry. For everything. If I could go back, he held up his hand, interrupting her. Clara, now is not the time. We need to focus on what matters. Then we'll see what to do with us. She nodded, swallowing back her tears. She knew Daniel was right, but the uncertainty about the future was overwhelming. While he went upstairs to his room, she stayed in the kitchen, hugging her own body as if that could protect her from the storm that was coming. The next few days were a whirlwind. Daniel began to investigate Miguel's contacts, looking for allies or other victims of his manipulations. Clara, for her part, did what she could to help, sharing information about the projects she worked on. The tension between them was palpable, but they both knew they couldn't afford any distractions. With each discovery, Daniel felt he was getting closer to something bigger, something that could bring Miguel down for good. But he also knew that he was dealing with a dangerous man, someone willing to do anything to protect his interests. That night, sitting in front of his computer, Daniel found something that changed everything. A document, hidden among several folders sent by Clara, revealed a contract involving Miguel and another executive. The details were vague, but there was enough to suggest a large-scale corruption scheme. He knew that this could be the key to exposing Miguel. But at the same time, he also knew that it put everyone around him at risk. He turned off the computer and took a deep breath. He was ready to take the next step. And this time, there would be no turning back. The day had come. Daniel was faced with a choice that would change not only his life, but that of everyone around him. After sleepless nights, he and Clara gathered everything they had. The contract they had found, Clara's messages with Miguel, and even the testimonies of work colleagues that Daniel had managed to convince to talk. Each piece formed a dark mosaic of manipulation and corruption. Clara was sitting on the edge of her bed, tension etched into every line of her face. Daniel, standing in front of the window, stared at the horizon, arms crossed. The room seemed too small to contain the weight of the moment. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Clara asked, her voice almost a whisper. There was regret in her tone, but also a trace of courage that Daniel had never noticed before. He turned, facing her. It's not a question of wanting to, Clara. It's a question of necessity. Miguel needs to be stopped. He's already destroyed enough. She nodded slowly, knowing that nothing she could say would change Daniel's decision. What about us? The question hung in the air for a moment, but Daniel didn't answer. Not because he didn't know, but because words seemed insufficient. That day, Daniel took everything he had to a trusted lawyer, someone he knew couldn't be bought by Miguel. The documents were carefully handed over and the plan was clear: expose Miguel publicly and hand everything over to the relevant authorities. It was risky, but Daniel knew it was the only way to ensure that the truth prevailed. While waiting for the legal developments, Daniel received an unexpected phone call. It was from Miguel. The man's voice, normally confident, now sounded nervous, almost desperate. "Daniel, we need to talk. It's in your interest." "My interest?" Daniel replied, his voice laced with sarcasm. "I think you've lost the right to talk about what's in my interest. Listen, I know you already know a lot, but there are details that could change your perspective. Meet me. Just once." Daniel hesitated. He knew it could be a trap, but he also knew that Miguel wouldn't be so desperate if he didn't have something to lose. After a few minutes of thought, he agreed, arranging to meet in a public place. When they arrived at the restaurant, Miguel looked like a shadow of his former self. The confident, articulate man now had deep circles under his eyes and restless gestures. He looked at Daniel as if trying to decipher him, but Daniel remained impassive. "I'll come straight to the point," Miguel began. "You're about to destroy more than you realize. There are people involved in this, people who could suffer severe consequences if you go ahead." "People?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Or do you mean accomplices?" Miguel sighed, rubbing his temples. "Some may be accomplices, but others are just pawns. People who were dragged into something they didn't fully understand." Daniel kept his gaze steady. "And you want me to believe that you're concerned about these people? That you have some sense of morality now?" Miguel leaned forward, the tone of his voice becoming more serious. "I've made mistakes, Daniel. Many of them. But you need to understand that if this blows up, there will be collateral victims." Daniel felt the anger bubbling up again, but something in Miguel's expression made him take a deep breath and step back. "You're trying to save your own skin, Miguel. Nothing more." Miguel didn't deny it. He knew there were no more masks to wear. "You're right. I'm trying to save what's left. But I'm also offering you something in return. Something that can help you." "And what would that be?" Daniel crossed his arms, clearly skeptical. "Additional evidence. Names. People bigger than me. You can destroy me, Daniel, but it won't end with me. It will only start a new chain of destruction." Daniel knew that Miguel was trapped. It was only a matter of time before he was exposed. But what Miguel was saying made sense. Maybe there was something bigger at stake. He stood up, looking Miguel in the eye for the last time. "I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to make sure you pay for what you've done. And you will." Daniel left, leaving Miguel behind, his face pale and his eyes fixed on the table. He knew there was nothing more he could do to escape. That week, the complaint was made. The impact was immediate. Miguel was removed from his post, and the investigations revealed a much bigger scheme than Daniel had imagined. Executives were arrested and Miguel's company collapsed. The news spread quickly, and Miguel's name became synonymous with corruption and betrayal. Clara, for her part, decided that she needed to start again. She knew that she had lost Daniel, that the bond between them had been irreparably broken. With tears in her eyes, she wrote him a letter, explaining that she loved him, but that she understood that the best thing for both of them was to go their separate ways. Daniel found the letter the next day and, although he felt a tightness in his chest, he knew it was the right thing to do. A few months later, Daniel met someone else. Someone who helped him rediscover what it meant to trust, love and start again. He still carried the scars of what he had experienced, but they no longer defined him. On the contrary, they were a reminder of his strength and resilience. Meanwhile, Clara began a new life away from it all. She never forgot Daniel, but used the lessons of the past to become someone better, stronger. Miguel, by contrast, spent the rest of his life struggling with the consequences of his actions. The man who had once thought himself untouchable was now a living example of how misused power can destroy everything. In the end, the truth prevailed. And although everyone's paths had parted, each found their own form of redemption, or punishment. If you've made it this far, let us know in the comments what you thought of this story. We want to know what you think. And remember, betrayal is never the answer. Our channel does not support any form of betrayal. Subscribe for more impactful and reflective stories. See you next time.